We would like to welcome you to our session on aquatic habitat connectivity. Our speaker today will be Sara Gottlieb. Sara is the Director of Freshwater Science and Strategy for the Georgia chapter of the Nature Conservancy. In this role, she currently focuses on freshwater projects in priority watersheds to improve habitat for the outstanding aquatic biodiversity found in Georgia's rivers and streams, while also balancing the needs of human communities for resilient water supplies and floodplains. Sara is co-lead of the Georgia Aquatic Connectivity team. So I will hand it over to you, Sara, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you too so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm so excited to be here. I was at the Confluence last year in person, and we did this as a hands-on workshop, and it's way more fun that way. But I'm gonna do my best here to get everyone's feet a little bit wet, even though only metaphorically, in the realm of aquatic habitat connectivity in a way that I think will hopefully be relatable and of interest to those of you that are involved in stream monitoring. So I first wanted to do a little interactive activity with you all, just to kind of get a sense of where everybody is coming from. So Cecilia, if you could put this link in the chat for everyone. Let's see, is that coming up? Yes, there you go. If you just go to that link that you see on here, and then I will go over to the map where you can all share with everyone, hopefully, if this works properly, where you survey streams. When this works right, it's really quite magical. So I'm crossing my fingers here that I'm going to start to see some dots popping up. Cecilia or Jenna, if you're, oh, there we go. Okay, I was just going to ask if this was working for anybody. Okay, great. We've got several in the Chattahoochee River watershed. Fantastic. Oh, excellent. Someone way up there in Northwest Georgia in the Tennessee Basin. Wonderful. Oh, somebody from South Carolina, I guess. All right, I'm gonna give it about 15 more seconds and see if we can get any more geographic diversity, but if not, that's fine. This is, that's just interesting and helpful for me to know. I know often we're missing sometimes, and this is true in the work I'm going to be talking about today, work below the fall line, in particular in the tidal zone. That's an area that's of interest, but just not a lot of folks working down there on this stuff. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. That was very interesting and helpful. Let me get back to my PowerPoint now. All right. So, as I mentioned, this is normally a hands-on workshop, and although it's very brief, it's sort of intended to get people who are interested in this topic, or get people interested in learning more about how you can do a standardized culvert assessment using a protocol that's been developed first in the Northeast and has been modified in the Southeast by the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership. In partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And we do workshops in person with up to about 15 or 20 people. We typically do 2 or 3 of these workshops per year in person. Obviously that's changed this year. But if this workshop sort of gets you interested in this topic and you'd like to know more, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the last slide of this presentation. And we maintain a waiting list of people who are interested, and we'll reach out to you when we have one coming up. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to go over in this session. First of all, I'm going to talk about the importance of aquatic connectivity. why is it something, what is it, first of all, or why is it something that we care about? Why is it something that we need to get a better handle on, and what can be done to improve it around the state? Then I'll go into the survey protocol that we use to conduct assessments of culverts at road crossing. We'll talk a little bit about how that data gets entered and validated and what we use it for. And then the last section is where we would really get into the details of the protocols. That's where we would go outside and have a little hands-on session. We can't do that, so I'm going to do my best just to show what that looks like, but hopefully it'll get y'all interested in getting out in the field when we're able to do that again. So when we talk about aquatic connectivity, of course, we're talking about the organisms that live in our rivers and streams. And when most of us think about that, you know, we think about fishes, salamanders, maybe turtles, crayfish. But then there's a whole range of other species that also live in or around our rivers and streams, or use them as ways to get from one place to another, or they depend on food supply that does live in rivers and streams. So we also think about things like river otters, obviously, raccoons, bears, even deer sometimes use these culverts under roads to avoid having to cross roads, which are very dangerous. So aquatic connectivity impacts a wide range of species, some of those that might not even seem that obvious. So in a healthy stream or river, we typically have this pattern of run, riffle, pool sequence that continues repeatedly for a long stretch. And those circumstances provide the habitat that's needed by this variety of species. But when you have something that interrupts that sequence, it vastly changes the habitat into something more like what we see and what we normally think of when we consider aquatic connectivity, which is dams. And dams obviously have a major impact on the health of aquatic habitats. It changes rivers into lakes. Obviously, lakes have their own appeal, but a lake is not a river. And a dam very obviously prevents organisms from moving from upstream to downstream and vice versa, and really cuts off their habitats. And the major way of dealing with dams, especially when they're in very ecologically important areas, is to remove them either entirely or partially. And this picture in the lower right-hand corner is a dam removal that happened a couple of years ago at the University of Georgia on the Middle Oconee River. That was the Whitehall Dam. But culverts can also be a major impact on aquatic habitat and really have an impact on connectivity. And a lot of people don't necessarily think of them, but they are absolutely ubiquitous. Think about every time that you're on a road that crosses over a river or a stream of almost any size, except the largest ones, the water has to get underneath that road somehow. And the way that most rivers and streams get under road crossings is through culverts. And these culverts have been built over a long period of time during a period when our rivers and streams weren't as valued as they are now, when we didn't know as much as we do know now. A lot of the culverts were not designed very well. They were too small, or they've just been there a long time and the stream bank around them has degraded. And therefore they become a severe barrier to aquatic connectivity. The good news is that we now have designs that are actually pretty simple, not necessarily any more expensive, not any more difficult to install. So when a new road crossing goes in, you'll most frequently see a design something like this. And this is what we refer to as an open bottom culvert, as opposed to a freestanding bridge. When you have a road going over a major river, you'll almost always just see a bridge. It's usually these smaller streams and creeks where you see culverts, and that's where this type of design, or even just, you know, a half pipe essentially that's been buried in the substrate can work similarly. So you can see that the natural substrate, you know, sediment, the entire width of the stream is contained within that crossing. So the good news is that we do have a solution to this problem. One thing I do want to mention here is that there is a guidebook. This was published in 2012 in partnership between the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. EPA. This does provide guidance to anyone who is in the process of designing a road crossing or replacing one. The Georgia Aquatic Connectivity team, which I co-lead, is in the process right now of updating this guidebook. A lot of things have changed in the last 8 to 9 years. Regulations have changed, designs have gotten better, and we have a number of case studies from around the state that will be featured. So look for that coming out in 2021, but in the meantime, this guidebook is actually already available on the Fish and Wildlife Service website. So how widespread is the problem of culverts as barriers to aquatic connectivity? Well, this is the entire Etowah watershed, which hopefully some of you are familiar with up in North Georgia, just a bit northeast of Rome. So these are all the major rivers and streams and creeks, quite a lot of them. When I overlay the number of crossings, not all of these are a barrier to aquatic connectivity, but a lot of them are. So when we think about all of those barriers, all of those places that our habitats are being fragmented, it's a huge issue that's extremely widespread. All right, so I'm going to go into a few details about the types of impacts that these culverts can have when they're not designed properly. So what you see here are some examples of excessive velocity. Now what's happening here is too much water, particularly at times of high flow, is being forced through a pipe. And for those of you who might remember your physics, if you take a large amount of water and constrict it down to a small area, it starts to flow much faster. For organisms that are trying to move either upstream or downstream, this can be a major problem, especially some of our smaller organisms like darters, minnows, crayfish. They really cannot compete. They can't move in the ways that they need to under these conditions. And also, when you see water, when you see water coming out that fast and with that much force, what you often see downstream of culverts that look like this is a large area of scour. It really impacts the stream banks. It reduces the stability, and over time it can really degrade. It can degrade the culverts themselves and become a dangerous situation. This is kind of the other side of that. This is the inlet side that just kind of shows how that excessive velocity comes to pass. So, you know, again, you're taking a stream that's a certain width and you're forcing all of that water to move through a very small pipe that can't really contain all of it. And obviously during extremely high flows, this can become a serious problem for public safety. Eventually all of that water won't be able to go through the pipe at all, and it'll start to flow up over. And that's when you start to see road washouts, which is not only a problem from a aquatic habitat standpoint, obviously, but a big problem for human safety, for transportation, for ambulances or fire trucks that need to get where they need to go, and so forth. Less dramatically, I suppose, but as much of a problem is when there's a drop, either at the inlet or the outlet. This is showing you places where there's an inlet drop. So essentially there's kind of a little bit of a waterfall at the inlet where the stream coming into the culvert is at a higher level than inside of the culvert itself. And this can create a connectivity problem, again, in particular for smaller organisms that can't make those leaps. More dramatically, and what we see most often, I would say this is the most common design problem that we see with culverts, is an outlet drop, or what we call perching. You may have seen this yourself when you're out doing your monitoring in streams. It's very, very common. I don't think most culverts are designed to be this way, but over time with those high velocity waters coming out, you start to have scour. The stream starts to degrade below the culvert, and you start to have this situation. Which essentially creates a waterfall, again, that small organisms, and in some cases even large organisms, just simply cannot cannot get up over that hump. So it works basically from an aquatic connectivity standpoint as much of a barrier as a dam. So this is a very serious issue. I've kind of described this a little bit already, but this idea of a scour hole is another thing that we see very commonly at the outlet of a culvert, especially ones where there's a lot of velocity coming through. But really at almost any culvert, over time what happens is a hole essentially gets dug by all of that water coming out with so much force, and creates a large pool, which again can degrade stream banks. You can kind of see on the right-hand side of this photo where that stream bank has been degraded, and it can start to undermine the culvert itself. This one is not quite in that situation, but I've seen quite a number where you have the scour hole getting so big that it starts to undermine the culvert itself. So it's bad for habitat, and it's also, again, a safety hazard. Here's one that we see that is intended to be a solution or preventive to the scour hole problem in the first place. And that's where a culvert gets put in. Downstream of the culvert, they'll do some armoring. So that's typically either a shelf of some concrete, sometimes it's riprap. I've seen a whole variety of materials used here. And that changes the natural substrate. It can change the natural flow pattern, and you can also end up with a situation like the photo here on the right, where you end up with head cutting essentially up to the edge of the armoring, and then the stream channel becomes perched, and you have your problem with connectivity because of that. Very common problem. Here's another one that is maybe less dramatic, but can be as serious of an issue for smaller organisms that and large ones that are trying to move upstream, and that is insufficient water depth. So a culvert can actually be too wide or too large, or just placed in such a way that the water depth going through the culvert is much, much, much shallower than the stream channel that's entering it and then leaving it. So when an organism, that needs to stay submerged the entire time tries to move through that, it runs into a problem. It really turns into a complete barrier. And at times of low flow, you can run into a situation where there's no water flowing through the culvert at all. So now I'm going to get a little bit into the methods that we use to assess all of these factors that I've talked about, and how that gets used to develop a score, basically, that helps us to prioritize culverts for potential replacement. So as I showed in that slide that had the Etowah watershed and all of those crossings, it can be a little bit overwhelming. And as I mentioned, not all of those crossings, not all of those culverts are a barrier to aquatic connectivity. So what we really want to know, what we need to know in order to address this issue effectively is which of these crossings are a problem, how much of a problem are they, and how likely is it that we'll be able to take some sort of corrective action. So that is what this protocol helps us to do. It enables us to take a standardized set of data in the field that gets entered into a database. A score is given to each crossing, and then with other information that we use, we're able to prioritize road crossings for remediation or removal, depending on the situation. So this is the data form, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now, but I will later. And I believe that with this presentation, you'll be provided with links to both the guidebook and to the field data form if you'd like to be able to download it for yourself. If you come to one of our workshops, we actually provide copies of all of this for you. One question that you might have is, if you're going to engage in culvert assessment, what type of equipment do you need? The good news is you don't need very much equipment, and a lot of it isn't very fancy. Some of it might be things that you have already. I'm sure many of you who are involved in stream monitoring already have a pair of waders, hip waders or boots, depending on the type of systems that you're working in that would guide how much protection that you need when you're getting out in the water in various types of conditions. A way to keep your data sheets organized or your electronic devices. I'll go into that in just a second to keep it from getting wet. And then the measurement equipment. So one thing that is definitely needed is transect tape or reel tape. One little detail that's a little bit odd and different from other survey methods is the algorithm that's used for the scoring assumes that you're taking all of your measurements in tenths of a foot. This equipment is sold both in inches as well as tenths of a foot. So that's just something that you have to be careful about when you're shopping for this equipment. Excuse me. Another one that is not necessarily essential but very useful is this measurement rods. This is like a measuring tape, but it stays very firm. It's really helpful for measuring things like water depth. So you can stick it in the water and it'll actually stay firm rather than sort of starting to float downstream. Very handy tool to have. This one right here in the middle of the screen might be a bit hard to see, is a telescoping leveling rod. That is very helpful and absolutely necessary for measuring the height, both of the structure itself, and you have one of the measurements is how much road fill is above the structure, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then the last thing is a safety vest, which I'm sure many of you do have. If you're parking on the side of a road, you have to walk to both the upstream and the downstream side. You want to always be safe. That is the #1 priority in doing this work. And that really is all the equipment that you need besides a pencil and perhaps an electronic data device for capturing that data if you don't want to write it down on a data sheet and then transcribe it over to your computer when you get back. So that's what this is all about. So here we have a team that was out surveying during one of our workshops a couple of years ago, and you can see everyone writing on their data sheets there, which is one way to do it. And then when you get back to your computer, you can enter all of the data into a database. Or what we have done in the last couple of years is develop a Survey 123 app. Survey 123 is an ArcGIS application. The app itself is free, and we can get you connected with the database so that all of the information that's on the data sheet is also in the app. So you can just enter the data into the app while you're in the field without ever having to fill out the data sheet. It saves time, it prevents transcription errors. It's really super handy. One of the other elements in taking the data is also photos. So you take photos upstream and downstream, at the inlet, at the outlet, and all of that just gets tied automatically along with the GPS point location. Everything is right there, and it's super handy and very easy to use. So I highly recommend it. So after that data has been entered, this is what it looks like. So this is the ArcGIS Online application. For those of you who might be familiar, it's an online version of ArcGIS that allows people in different locations and different organizations to work on data sets together and to share that information and generate maps. Very useful. So all of the information that is obtained from all of our teams that have been trained in using this protocol gets entered into this database where I and others who are working on this issue can look at that information statewide. In fact, this is a database that works across the entire southeastern US. So each of these dots, the colors on here, indicates how each crossing was assessed, its level of barrierity, kind of a weird word. But you can see not all of them are a problem. In fact, quite a lot of them are not a barrier at all or very insignificant. Sometimes we think that there is a crossing and there actually isn't. And then some of them are, severe or some level of barrier that needs to be addressed. So this data is very useful in looking across watersheds. I'm just going to go in a little closer on this watershed that I have in the square on your screen. It's the Holly Creek watershed, which is a subwatershed in the Conasauga River Basin. I remember some of you, or at least one of you, indicated that you survey streams, I think in this part of the state, so maybe you're familiar with it. So here's a close-up of the Holly Creek watershed outlined in purple. This is a project that the Nature Conservancy undertook last year, so summer of 2019. We had funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is focused in this watershed and is funding a variety of organizations to develop baseline data and implement conservation actions to have a positive benefit on the incredible aquatic biodiversity that is in this watershed. So we were interested in knowing on a comprehensive basis what the situation was with aquatic connectivity in the basin. So we did an analysis. All the little red dots that you can see on here are road crossings at streams. So we hired a team, actually several teams, to spend the summer going out and surveying every single one of these crossings and using this assessment protocol. So now you can see here what the results of that survey was. There were some crossings that were not crossings at all, so they've been removed. Sometimes GIS data isn't the most accurate. There's either no stream there, or there's no road there, or it's a low water crossing or something else. You can see that, again, as I mentioned, not all road crossings. In fact, sometimes only a relatively small number of all of them are actually a barrier. So there were over 200 road crossings in this watershed, and you can see we assessed 19 of them as severe, and in total, moderate, significant, or severe came in at, under 40. So out of 200, there were under 40 that we consider to actually be a problem. Here's what some of those sites look like. A couple of the members of our crew looking super excited. Like I said, they spent all summer doing this work. It can be hot and wet, but it's pretty satisfying when you see that data set at the end. It was actually teams we hired was a group of high school students through our Leaders for Environmental Action for the Future LEAF program. So these were high school students that were selected to participate and learn how conservation work gets done. And they spent almost the entire summer working on this culvert assessment. So they became real experts. But you can see the kind of situations they ran across, some of the things I've talked about. Here's some of that armoring at the outlet. You can see in this upper right-hand one, there's not enough water flowing through. And then here's an example in the lower right-hand corner of perching. So they got to see it all. Now, the cool thing is we're using that information to actually address some of the really bad crossings, the ones that were prioritized. These are from some previous projects that the Nature Conservancy has completed. I just wanted to show you what it looks like when you go from a really bad crossing that's a big barrier to aquatic connectivity to one that is actually much better for the system. So here on the left, we see a crossing that has multiple very small culverts. This was actually a very high biodiversity stream in the Raccoon Creek watershed in the Etowah from my first example. You can see the problem with this. You don't even have to do an assessment really. They're too small, it's very constricted. It became clogged frequently and had to be cleared out. There was no movement of fishes from downstream to upstream before we conducted our project, which was to replace this crossing with a freestanding bridge. What you see standing underneath there is my colleague Katie Owens, dressed as Daphne the darter. So we have two species of darter, Cherokee darter and Etowah darter. One is threatened and the other is actually endangered, that live in this system and needed access to very high quality habitat upstream. The really great news is almost immediately after we completed this project, the bridge was put in, we were able to document the fish moving from downstream to upstream. So very satisfying to see that done. This is another example in a really big project. I didn't talk much about box culverts, but this is another one that you run across quite frequently and often when it's a relatively large road, 2-lane or 4-lane, over a pretty big creek. This is over Raccoon Creek, again in the Etowah watershed. This road crossing, which is actually Raccoon Creek Road over Raccoon Creek, had been prioritized by a number of organizations, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Paulding County, had all been interested in doing something to address the connectivity issue at this crossing for a long time. Finally, last year, this picture was actually taken last fall, I believe, these box culverts were replaced again with a freestanding bridge, and you don't have to be an expert to see the improvements in aquatic habitat and connectivity once that was done. We worked with a group at Kennesaw State University to document fish movement before and after. There was actually a student who made his master's thesis out of this, and he tagged fishes with little electronic probes that then pinged a sensor upstream and downstream, and he was able to document that we went from almost no movement of fish upstream and downstream to basically free movement for about 41 species of fish that live in this system. So that was really exciting. All right, well, this is the part where I would normally be saying, okay, everyone, let's put on our boots and head outside, and it would look something like this. But of course we can't go outside, unfortunately. So I'm gonna do my best to make this interesting so you can see a little bit of what it looks like when you get out in the field to take these measurements to help us get a sense of where we have these aquatic connectivity issues at road crossings. But first, I would like to do another poll just to break things up a little bit and hear from everybody, especially those of you that get out in streams frequently. What is the strangest thing you've found in a stream? Now, just give me 1 second because I need to switch over the poll to the next one. Uh-oh, here it is. Okay, if this is working properly, you should be able to type in your response. What's the strangest thing you've ever found in a stream? For those of you who might not be familiar with the image that I have here in the background, that's a hellbender, which is a pretty strange thing and a pretty exciting thing to find in a stream. It's I think the largest salamander, I think in North America, definitely in the Southeast, really cool. Somebody's found an aquatic worm, northern hogsucker, excellent. Anything that's not an organism, like, are you doing a stream cleanup and found, I don't know, we find diapers, Coke bottles, all sorts of weird things. An electric scooter? I bet that's someone in the Atlanta area. I know those scooters disappeared sometime over the summer at around the time of the pandemic, but now they're coming back. I don't know about that. Let's see, somebody found a toilet lid. Nice, actually not nice. Somebody found a bed frame, okay. A platinum something, a platinum club, maybe a platinum club card. Wow, this is interesting. Axle. I've actually seen an entire car in a stream in, I think it was in Proctor Creek, actually. That was interesting. It really is amazing the lengths that people will go to abuse our streams. Okay. Somebody found a Playboy. All right. That must have been exciting. A tank. Oh my gosh. I don't even want to ask. All right, everyone. Thanks. That was fun. I have all these weird pictures in my mind of strange things showing up in streams. Good grief. Okay, so thanks. That was fun. So here's a link. Cecilia, if you can, type or copy that link into the chat, and then everyone can have access to the guide. So normally we'd be standing out in the field and I'd be handing out this guide to everybody, where you could read all of the details about how to take all of these measurements. But if you go to the link, you can flip through it yourself after we're done on this webinar, or just whenever. And part of that guidebook at the very back is the stream crossing survey data form, which, as I mentioned, you can use just to write in the measurements that you're taking, or kind of use as a guide as you're running through the app. I have here another link directly to that field sheet. If you want to go ahead and copy that into the chat so everyone can access it directly. But again, it is part of the guidebook. You'll find it at the very back of the guidebook. So here on the left, you see a guy who is starting to take some of those measurements. So as you start working through the data form, you know, you'll be getting right out into the water, as you can kind of see this fellow doing in the upper right-hand corner. So I'm just going to walk through the fields here just a little bit to give you a sense of the types of measurements you'll be taking. So some of them are just visual. You know, you'll get out of your car and walk down to the stream and have a look to see what type of a crossing is it? Is it a bridge? Is it a culvert? A multiple culvert is a situation like that one that I showed earlier that had those 4 box culverts. Sometimes you'll have a situation where there's, you know, a series of those pipes. It's not always just one sort of conveyance. Sometimes it's more than one. And then each one of those is assessed separately. Sometimes you'll find that the crossing is really just a ford, or there's no crossing at all, or it's been removed, and then no further data needs to be taken. I mentioned that you'll be taking photos. So you'll take a photo of both the inlet and the outlet, and then you'll turn away from the culvert itself and take pictures upstream and downstream. That can be helpful later on when the team that takes the data into the database sometimes needs to confirm something that doesn't make sense. Or if a site is selected, it helps to get a sense of what is the situation without actually going in the field. It actually turns out to be a very useful bit of information. You want to take some data about the condition of flow at the time that you're out there. Obviously, you might be out there at a time when it's very dry, or there's no flow at all, or that it's sort of typical, regular amount of flow, or maybe, you know, hopefully you're being safe, you're out there during a time of really high flow. And that can have some impact on the results of the data that you're taking. So sometimes if there's no flow, then you won't be able to assess some elements. Sometimes if there's very high flow, you might not even be able to see whether the culvert itself might be perched, say during a period of lower flow. You want to take some data about the condition of the crossing. That helps to understand sort of the likelihood that if it is a problem, it would be able to be addressed. So you know, if a crossing is both a barrier to aquatic connectivity and it's failing, then it's likely that you'd be able to get some help, say from the Department of Transportation. If it's brand new and it's a problem, then that's a real problem because you're unlikely to get a lot of support for addressing it, unfortunately. I mentioned we don't really have a lot of people doing this work in the tidal area. We actually are working on developing a protocol specific to tidal sites, and we're interested in having more of that work done. Road fill height is something that I mentioned, where you'll need to take a measurement from the top of the culvert itself to the top of the road, and that tells you how much fill there is. That is one of the most important predictors in how much it's going to cost if the culvert needs to be removed. Believe it or not, moving dirt is one of the most expensive aspects of these projects. Then you want to get a sense of what's the channel like, and how does the culvert relate to that channel. So does the culvert span the entire width? Does it go from one bank to the other, or maybe even a little bit, you know, wider than the stream channel itself and encompass some of the banks? Is there a scour pool at the either at the inlet or at the outlet? You're going to look at what the vegetation is like in the overstory and the understory, just again to get a sense of what the situation is like at the site. One other thing that we added when we started working with our partners at the Georgia Department of Natural Resources is whether bats are present. Bats actually sometimes use culverts as hibernacula during certain times of the year, and that's a good thing. We need to know that because if it's a project that's going to be addressed through some sort of construction project, we need to know whether bats are there so that construction can be done during a time of the year that they won't be impacted. Here are some more of the data fields that you'll start to get into when you begin to assess each structure. So as I mentioned, if you have more than one culvert, you'll actually do these measurements for each one. So you want to get a sense of what kind of material is the structure made out of. A lot of them are these sort of metal corrugated structures, and some are concrete. You run into all kinds of, when you start looking at older crossings, you'll see wood or rock. You can sometimes have a combination of things, very interesting. Outlet shape, this is coded, but it's getting a sense of whether it's round or oval shaped or square or actually embedded, whether there's armoring, like that tail armoring, oops, that I mentioned earlier. We want to get a sense of the grade. This is where we get into you know, whether the culvert is perched at all. So, you know, a good crossing would be one where the crossing is at, where the culvert is at the stream grade. It starts to get worse from there, where you have, whoops, this one on the right here is what we would term a free fall, and this one here on the upper left is more of a cascade. So the water is falling onto some rocks and then again and sort of creating like a waterfall situation. And you'll be taking measurements of both the outlet and the inlet. So that's where you start getting into that equipment. This is that stadia rod that I had mentioned, which especially when you have a large structure is very useful for taking the height and sometimes the width measurements. You'll also be measuring the length all the way through. That's one thing that the transect tape is very helpful for. And then there's additional conditions that you're going to be looking at. You may be interested in knowing whether there's internal structures or if there's anything basically clogging up the culvert, as in this situation here on the lower right. You'll be looking at the substrate. Is it similar to the stream or is there none at all? That is very important for understanding whether aquatic organisms can or will pass. Let's see, you'll be looking at the water depth. As I mentioned, you know, a situation where it's much shallower. Sometimes you find that it's much deeper if there's a lot of constriction, or sometimes it can be completely dry. You'll be looking at the water velocity. Is there dry passage through the structure? That is important for organisms like, say, raccoons, that aren't necessarily going to want to walk in the stream, but they will, but they are walking along the stream bank and they're using that for dry passage through the structure. And then there's room for additional comments, just other things that you might notice or things that you're not sure about, or if you weren't able to take a measurement for some reason. And then I don't think, no, I didn't include it here, but there are additional measurements upstream. In particular, you try to get upstream of the barrier as far as you can to get a sense of what's the condition of the stream in an area where it's not being impacted. That's actually one of the first steps when you get to a site, is walk upstream until you get to an area where it seems like the stream is in more or less natural condition, get a sense of the bank full width, get a sense of the substrate, get a sense of the velocity and the depth, and what that stream looks like in a place where it's not being impacted by that crossing. All of this information then gets crunched using an algorithm that spits out a score, which is what I showed you on a couple of those maps that gives us an idea of how much of a barrier. So that is how we do this. I see there's a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A. Let me see if I can go ahead and address those now. So Betty Jean Jordan says, are state and local culvert design standards, e.g. design based on the 25-year storm, generally sufficient from an aquatic connectivity standpoint? I'm going to give that a qualified yes. The current standards, which actually pretty well follow the guidebook that I mentioned earlier, are generally sufficient. Now, one of the issues that we run into is even though the standards are sufficient, what happens when the culvert gets built or when the road crossing gets built is it doesn't always necessarily actually follow those standards. So that's a real problem that we're trying to address through the regulatory process. All right, Betty Jean has another question. Is riprap outlet protection generally benign or detrimental to aquatic connectivity? You know, it kind of depends. I've just seen so many situations where it ends up degrading over time, and even if it isn't at first a problem, it becomes a problem because of that head cutting. Another issue that I haven't really talked about is the behavior of specific organisms is really important when you're talking about aquatic connectivity. A crossing might look like it's passable, but you have to kind of think from the point of view of an organism. So particularly organisms that are, you know, closer to the substrate. If they come across something in the river bottom that's not the natural substrate, it'll stop them from moving. They'll either be too afraid or they just are not able to move over a substrate that's not the natural substrate. So that protection just kind of adds to that, you know, length of area that doesn't have natural substrate and sometimes prevents organisms from moving. All right, another question from Betty Jean. Do you work in cities and counties to address aquatic connectivity when they do culvert repair and replacement? I personally don't, but there definitely are people who do. There's a new member of our team from the City of Atlanta Watershed Department who's very interested in this topic. I guess I shouldn't say no. We did work very closely, and we always do actually when we're doing these replacements with the local municipalities. And sometimes they are interested in doing these projects, again, because of the public safety and the transportation issues. So the answer is yes and no. My equivocation on that was just that the Nature Conservancy doesn't tend to work in more urbanized areas, but there definitely are other members of our aquatic connectivity team that do. So yes, just not me personally. I think that was all I had in my presentation. Let me get to my last slide. There we go. You can see my contact information. If you have more questions, if you're interested in being put on the wait list for the longer and actually in-person version of this workshop, please feel free to drop me an email. You can get more information about my work at the Nature Conservancy at the website listed there below. And do please check out the Georgia Aquatic Connectivity team at that link at the lower right. We post news about and information about our projects, more photos of road crossings, culverts that we've addressed. We have a brand new handbook on dam removals for anyone that might be interested in that, although I didn't talk about dam removals today. It's also something I'm very passionate about. And once we can complete the revision of the road crossing handbook, it will also be posted there as well. So please do check those out and drop me a note if you want more information about any of that. I'm happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sarah, so much.
Yeah.
It was a really awesome presentation.
Sure.
When you showed that overlay of crossings on the Etowah, I was shocked because I'm living in Rome right now, and I was
okay.
like my backyard.
Yeah, I guarantee after this talk, you won't be able to cross over a stream without looking, you know, trying to look outside your car and go, what kind of crossing is that?
Right. Well, I went ahead and shared your email in the chat. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing so that we can do our Q&A.
Great.
If you guys do have any more questions, please feel free to throw those into our Q&A, and we'll be sure to direct those to Sarah. I had a quick one, actually. I was wondering, how old are a lot of those culverts? Like, when were they built? You know, how long does it take to get all that, the scour holes that you were talking about?
I mean, it's highly variable. You know, as you can imagine, you know, people have been living in Georgia and building roads for hundreds of years, I guess. And every time a stream is crossed, some sort of a structure has to be built. So some of them are quite old. I mean, really, when I'm doing these types of assessments, I run across everything you can possibly imagine, you know, crossings that look like they've been there for 50 years or more, and some that look like they just were, you know, constructed or maybe reconstructed in the last couple of years. It really runs the gamut. Yeah, it's interesting. Some of those old historic ones are kind of cool. Cobblestones, you know. It's interesting.
Yeah. I was surprised if they were new, because you said that they were trying to use those more like wide structures. So if they are still putting in culverts, that still happens.
Yeah, I've seen some really disturbing scenarios. Once I was actually in a one of the state parks where there was a crossing over a trout stream, where you would think that they would be hypersensitive to anything that's going to impact, you know, the aquatic habitat. And it was terrible. It was perched, it was too shallow, it had massive armoring. I mean, so many problems. And I actually ended up getting in touch with people I knew at the Department of Natural Resources to find out, how could this possibly happen? And that's what I mean when I say, you know, the regulations exist, the information exists, the guidelines exist, and probably when it got permitted, it looked all good in the design, but then what actually gets built sometimes is not what was intended. So unfortunately, there's way too much of that, even with our newer crossings.
Betty said that sometimes a culvert can be sized large enough so that a portion of the bottom is buried, allowing sufficient flow as well as connectivity.
Yep, that's right. It doesn't necessarily require any kind of fancy design or anything more expensive or special. It's really just, you know, giving some consideration to the situation, you know, and letting the bottom of the stream be the bottom of the culvert can be a very easy solution.
Are there any more questions? We'll go ahead and hang out for just a second.
Yeah. It's so much more fun when I can be out in the field talking with everybody.
No, I wish, maybe, hopefully next year, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Are you guys still doing are you still doing workshops right now? Are they virtual? Or are you hanging on until?
We haven't been doing any workshops virtually. It really, you know, it really requires being out there in the field, hands-on, looking at different situations and how you might handle this or that. It just, you know, when you're trying to get people trained to the point where they can take data, you know, that meets the standards that we need, it really is important to get people out in the field. So we've kind of been in a holding pattern this year.
Right. Well, it looks like we do have a question from Anne. She said, are some bigger bridges lots of logs? Sorry, wait. Some bigger bridges lots of logs pile up?
Yeah.
How are those removed or addressed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I see that a lot. Places where there's, you know, like that picture that I showed of the one that just was completely clogged up. You know, it's addressed on a case-by-case basis and can depend on whether the municipality is really involved. They should be, because it not only is creating an aquatic connectivity problem, but it can lead to the failure of that crossing and, like I mentioned, become a safety hazard problem for transportation. Sometimes when I see a really bad situation, but it's something that can be addressed quickly, you know, just by dealing with whatever's clogging it up, if I can find out kind of who's responsible or just get in touch with somebody at the local municipality, we'll do that so they can come and get it cleared out.
Great. Well, that was a lot of really great information. If we don't have any more questions, I guess we'll go ahead and, oh, we have one more. There we go. Oh, she just said thank you. Yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Sara, for your amazing presentation. We really appreciate you coming here and talking all about that.
No problem.
Yeah, so just a few closing remarks and reminders. If you have not already, please join our Confluence 2020 Facebook group to keep up to date on our last two sessions, I guess, of Confluence and connect with fellow conference attendees. Additionally, if you don't already, please follow us on Instagram and Facebook to keep up with our latest goings-ons in Adoptive Stream. And like I said, we have 2 sessions left. We have our Hidden Rivers movie night tomorrow night. Please join us for that. And then we have our keynote urine review and awards ceremony on Saturday. So we'd love it if you guys would register and come to those. It's going to be a great time. You can register for those sessions on our session registration page on our website. Additionally, if you missed one of our sessions during the conference and you really wanted to see it, Well, you're in luck. They are all uploaded onto our YouTube channel and posted onto our resources and recordings page on our website. And everything that I just mentioned, Jenna just posted all the links in the chat, so you can go ahead and check those out.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. And Sarah also is giving some praise to Hidden Rivers. Hidden Rivers is awesome. So anyone who is interested in viewing that with us tomorrow night, please do join. A few other things we have going on for Confluence is our annual silent auction. And so this year the silent auction is online and you can bid on these items until August 31st, which is coming up pretty quickly. I think it's
less than a week,
or something like that. Yeah. There's lots of great items there. There's winery tours and mountain getaways and tickets to lots of things around both within Atlanta and also a bit further away. So lots of neat things to look at. And then another note is when you leave this webinar, you're going to be automatically directed to a survey, just asking you 5 questions kind of about this session. And we would really appreciate it if you would take the time to fill that out, because that helps us let us know what you guys think about these sessions and help us improve them for next year's Confluence and all of the years after that. So thank you in advance for hopefully filling that survey out. And as always, if you are interested in learning more about Adopt a Stream, the program, or have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out. Email is the best way to contact us, and it's in that list of links that I posted in the chat. All right, well, again, thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for coming. And we hope to see you either tomorrow or the next day, and have a great night.